My name is Eleanor Whitcomb, and I am 65 years old. I've spent most of my life building and managing Brooks Tech alongside my family, keeping our books precise, our clients satisfied, and our small empire intact. I like to think of myself as careful, patient, and level-headed, but nothing in my long career, or even my decades of family life, could have prepared me for the text that lit up my phone that Thursday night. It came just after 10 when the house had settled into quiet. I was sitting in my living room, a cup of chamomile tea warming my hands, the low hum of the refrigerator filling the silence. The ping of my phone made me flinch, a sound so ordinary it normally wouldn't have drawn my attention. But the moment I unlocked it, the words on the screen froze me in place. "We no longer trust you. Don't come tomorrow." My chest tightened as I read it again. Slowly, deliberately, my son, my own child. The person I had raised, guided, and believed in for 38 years. He had sent me a text that erased years of shared history in a single sentence. I could feel my fingers trembling as I held the phone, staring at the words, as if they might change if I looked long enough. My heart pounded. A cold rush of disbelief swept over me, mingled with something sharper: pain, betrayal, confusion. For years, I had been the one holding things together, balancing budgets, smoothing over disputes, staying late when the numbers didn't add up. And now, the son I had trusted above all else had drawn a line I didn't understand. I sat back in my chair, letting the phone rest on my lap, blinking at the glowing screen. Images of family dinners, birthdays, and quiet late-night conversations came unbidden, clashing violently with the emptiness of that message. How could everything feel normal one moment and then utterly shattered the next? I raised the phone again, my thumb hovering over the screen. A single word formed in my mind, steady despite the tremor in my chest. Understood. I typed it slowly, deliberately. Not anger, not defense, just understood. A quiet acknowledgement of the new boundary, though. I didn't fully grasp what it meant yet. I set the phone down, chest tight, staring into the shadows of the living room. Outside, Salt Lake City's nightlights twinkled against the mountains. Tomorrow, I wouldn't go to work, but what came after that, I couldn't yet see. The silence settled around me, heavy and strange, as if the world itself had paused. I stared at the phone long enough for the words to sink deeper than I expected. My thumb hovered over the keyboard, and a quiet, deliberate thought rose to the surface: understood. Not angry, not pleading, not even questioning, just understood. I typed it slowly, each letter deliberate, like pressing a mark into stone. Then I set the phone down on the side table, the glow fading into the dim lamplight. My hand shook slightly, though I tried to steady it. I didn't cry, not yet, but a tight knot of grief and disbelief lodged itself firmly in my chest. A lifetime of loyalty, a lifetime of quiet sacrifices, felt suddenly meaningless. Decades of devotion to my family and to Brooks Tech, the company my parents had founded in our Salt Lake City garage, flashed through my mind. I remembered staying late night after night, poring over spreadsheets to catch errors that could have cost the company thousands. I remembered negotiating client contracts, smoothing over disagreements between siblings, and quietly picking up the pieces whenever something threatened to unravel. I had devoted myself, fully believing that integrity, patience, and unwavering dedication mattered more than recognition or praise. And yet, that single text suggested that all of it had been invisible. That my son, the one person I had thought would always see me clearly, no longer trusted me. The thought pressed on my chest like a physical weight. Anger simmered beneath my ribs, restrained because it had nowhere to go. Grief settled in beside it, quiet but unrelenting. I felt helpless in a way I hadn't in decades. There were no numbers to balance, no contracts to negotiate, no meetings to fix. There was only the hollow space left by someone who had once been my closest ally. I rose from the chair and walked to the window, pressing my palms against the cool glass. Salt Lake City stretched out below me, lights flickering in rhythm with my pulse. The mountains stood distant and unyielding solid in a way that made my own vulnerability feel sharper. I traced the familiar streets with my eyes, trying to anchor myself in a world that still seemed real, even as the foundation of my family life shifted beneath me. I thought of the years, the board meetings, the late nights, the countless quiet gestures no one had noticed, and I felt a wave of exhaustion. I had given everything, and now had to consider that what I had taken for granted, the trust of my own child, could vanish overnight. And yet, even in the tremor of fear and grief, a small clarity emerged. Understood didn't mean defeated. It meant acknowledgement. It meant that I had seen the line my son had drawn, and that I would navigate whatever came next with eyes wide open. I set the phone down again, my breath steadying. Outside, the night remained quiet, indifferent to my turmoil. Tomorrow, the office would feel different. But tonight, I sat alone, the word understood, echoing in my mind, heavy and immutable as the first step into a new, uncertain chapter of my life. I leaned back in my chair, letting my gaze drift over the city lights outside the window. My mind wandered decades into the past, to a time when life felt simpler and loyalty wasn't a fragile thing hanging by a thread. My parents, John and Marjorie Whitcomb, had started Brooks Tech in our garage in Salt Lake City when I was barely old enough to reach the workbench. Summers were spent elbow-deep in cables, testing early software programs and learning the rhythm of our fledgling company. I remember the smell of solder and coffee mingling with the scent of sun-warmed pine drifting in from the Wasatch Mountains. My parents poured everything into that small garage, hours energy dreams that seemed too big for a city, just beginning to embrace technology. I watched them huddle over lines of code on old, flickering monitors, whispering plans and strategies, sometimes laughing, sometimes frowning in concentration. And I learned to listen to understand the value of careful calculation and quiet perseverance. Winters brought different memories. While snow blanketed the streets, we huddled indoors around the warmth of space heaters, arguing over board games, or debating the merits of different programming approaches. My parents' vision was relentless, but they always included us in their way in the unfolding adventure. Even at 8 or 10 years old, I felt the weight of responsibility, not heavy, but thrilling. We were building something that mattered. As I grew older, my siblings and I each carved our own roles. My older brother Thomas had a knack for client relationships, charming and persuasive. My younger sister Caroline had a careful, analytical mind and a natural instinct for keeping the peace between us when disagreements arose. And I, Eleanor, had found my place in the numbers, in the spreadsheets and ledgers, ensuring that every dollar was accounted for, that our empire would stand on solid ground. There was pride in those years in the sense that we were more than a family. We were a team, united by shared vision and effort. I remember walking through the office as a teenager, past rows of blinking monitors, listening to the hum of printers and the chatter of engineers, feeling a quiet certainty that we were building something meaningful together. Every small victory felt personal, every setback a lesson. Yet nostalgia is bittersweet. I remember those years vividly now because I can feel how far removed they are from the present. Loyalty, once so tangible, now feels tenuous. The trust I once assumed would endure indefinitely has been tested, fractured, and questioned. I think back to the late nights I spent double-checking ledgers, the moments I kept secrets, not out of deceit, but out of protection. And I realize how much of my life was invested in a vision that now feels under threat. The glow of the Salt Lake City skyline doesn't comfort me tonight. Instead, it reminds me that the foundation of everything I built with my parents, with my siblings, with my son, was always delicate. And now, even as I reflect on those formative years, I feel the sharp pang of loss, the certainty that loyalty is never guaranteed, no matter how much heart you pour into it. Even as I lingered on memories of those early formative years, I couldn't ignore the present. Small, almost imperceptible signs had begun to appear, tiny fissures in the foundation of our family that I had been too busy or too trusting to notice before. My son Aaron, who had once followed me around the office as a teenager, now seemed increasingly distant. His calls were shorter, his messages curt. There was a hesitancy in his tone that made me pause every time I answered the phone, as if he were measuring his words carefully, deciding which parts of himself to share and which parts to keep hidden. The tension didn't stop with him. My siblings, Thomas and Caroline, carried the weight of their own ambitions, and the subtle rivalries that had simmered during our youth now began to bubble into the open. Thomas had always been charismatic, able to charm clients and colleagues alike, and for years I had accepted that his confidence sometimes overshadowed my meticulous behind-the-scenes work. Caroline, the peacemaker, tried to smooth over our disputes, but even she now occasionally shot me wary glances, as if weighing whose side she should take, in a conflict she hadn't yet fully understood. At family gatherings, I began noticing the small things, the way Thomas would interrupt me mid-sentence, taking credit for ideas I had spent hours refining, the quiet smirk Caroline gave when one of Thomas's jokes subtly diminished my contributions, the way Aaron sometimes avoided eye contact with me, leaving long pauses that carried the weight of unspoken thoughts. Each moment was fleeting, almost dismissible, but together they formed a pattern I could no longer ignore. I remember one evening, seated around the dining room table after a long day at the office, Thomas recounted a success meeting with a client, speaking as if I had not even contributed to the proposal. I tried to interject politely, pointing out some numbers only I would have noticed, but Caroline quickly changed the topic, and Aaron's attention remained fixed on his phone, thumbs moving with quiet, deliberate speed. My words hung in the air, ignored, while the laughter and chatter continued around me. I felt a cold knot of unease settle in my stomach. Driving home that night, I replayed the scene repeatedly. I asked myself whether I was imagining things, whether my perceptions were being colored by fatigue or lingering resentment from years of putting the family and company first. But deep down, the unease persisted. I could sense subtle alliances forming, loyalties bending toward convenience rather than principle. Even Aaron, whose trust I had taken for granted, seemed to be stepping back, testing boundaries I had assumed were secure. By the time I reached my apartment, the unease had grown into suspicion. The small fissures I had brushed off for months now seemed like cracks, capable of widening if ignored. The thought made my chest tighten, not just for myself, but for the company we had built, and for the fragile trust I had long believed unbreakable. Somewhere beneath the daily interactions, beneath the smiles and polite exchanges, a shift was occurring. And I could feel with a clarity that made my heart race that those cracks were only the beginning. The unease that had been gnawing at me didn't dissipate with time. In fact, it grew sharper as I returned to the office the following week. Sitting at my desk in BrooksTech's main conference room, surrounded by stacks of financial reports and spreadsheets, I felt the familiar pulse of responsibility, the same pulse that had guided me through decades of accounting budgets and audits. But today, something felt off. It started with a small anomaly, almost invisible, a consulting fee I didn't remember approving. I double-checked the vendor name, Pacific Horizon, and found nothing in our contracts or correspondence. My initial thought was a clerical error. These things happened, but a shadow of doubt lingered. I ran a quick cross-check with previous quarterly statements. The pattern was subtle but unmistakable. Similar unexplained expenses had appeared sporadically over the past 6 months. Each one was modest alone, but together they formed a mosaic of inconsistencies. I leaned back, pressing my palms into my eyes. I knew my instinct mattered, honed over years of reconciling figures that could make or break the company. My training told me to follow these irregularities, even if they seemed minor. My mind raced, connecting dots I hadn't noticed before. Payments that didn't match project invoices, reimbursements that lacked supporting documentation, tiny deviations buried in the vast spreadsheets. Thomas walked past my desk, humming softly, oblivious to the tension knotting my shoulders. I had a good relationship with him, but his charisma sometimes masked the less visible details, the subtle shifts in responsibility that only I noticed. Caroline stopped by a few minutes later, offering a smile as she asked if I wanted coffee. I forced a polite nod, not revealing the storm that had already begun forming in my mind. The more I looked, the more the numbers unsettled me. My heart beat faster as I pulled transaction after transaction. None of them made sense at first glance, but my instinct screamed that something wasn't right. The sums didn't match invoices. The dates were inconsistent, and some accounts seemed to carry phantom entries. It wasn't yet a crisis, but it was a warning. A whisper that something beneath the surface was shifting, threatening to undermine everything we had worked for. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was seeing only the tip of a hidden problem. I recalled late nights from my early years at Brooks Tech, hours spent reconciling tiny discrepancies, catching mistakes that others had overlooked. Back then, the errors had been honest oversights or miscalculations. But the precision of these anomalies suggested something different, something deliberate. I felt the weight of responsibility settle on my shoulders, heavier than ever. For a moment, I allowed myself to imagine worst-case scenarios: misappropriation of funds, covert dealings, a deliberate attempt to mislead the leadership. My stomach twisted at the thought, but my training didn't allow panic. I compiled my notes, flagged each suspicious transaction, and started plotting the next steps. The warnings were subtle, but I could feel the trajectory of trouble if ignored. As I left the office that evening, the city lights of Salt Lake flickered against the snowy Wasatch foothills. I pulled my coat tighter, thinking about the shadows I had glimpsed behind the numbers. The first warning had sounded soft and quiet, but unmistakable. And I knew deep in my bones that ignoring it could cost more than money. It could cost trust, family, and everything I had built. The next morning, I returned to Brooks Tech with a sense of both purpose and unease. The office smelled of brewed coffee and printer toner, familiar and grounding. Yet my mind was sharp, restless, aware that something was slipping through the cracks. I opened my laptop and pulled up the ledger, scanning line after line, each entry a potential clue. The anomalies I had noticed yesterday now demanded deeper investigation. It didn't take long to find them. Pacific Horizon appeared again, this time with a larger payment than the one from last week. No contract, no invoice, no explanation beyond a vague note about consulting services. My chest tightened. I pulled up the corresponding emails. There were none. I called Peter Hayes, our head accountant, hoping for a simple explanation. "Peter, what is this payment to Pacific Horizon?" I asked, keeping my tone neutral, professional. He paused, then replied smoothly, "It's a one-off consulting fee approved by Thomas. Nothing to worry about, Eleanor." I felt a chill run down my spine. Peter's reassurance sounded practiced, too smooth, too final. I asked for the approval emails, the invoices, any documentation, but he brushed it off, promising to look into it later. My instinct screamed that this wasn't a clerical oversight. Lunch was quiet. I met Caroline in the break room, quietly laying out my concerns. "Caroline, have you seen these payments? There's no paper trail." She picked at her salad, avoiding my gaze. "Eleanor, it's probably just a mix-up. You know how Thomas is. He likes to handle things his way." Let it go. Mom and Dad hate conflict. Her words stung a mix of concern and dismissal. I nodded politely, but inside, unease bloomed into alarm. Vague contracts, unapproved payments, and smooth reassurances, all signs pointed to something deliberate. The ledger was telling a story that few were willing to hear. By the afternoon, I had cross-referenced previous months. Pacific Horizon was just one piece of a pattern. Other vendors appeared with unclear purposes. Small payments spread across accounts in ways that obscured the trail. The sums weren't enormous individually, but collectively they hinted at intent, not error. I stayed late poring over spreadsheets under the harsh glow of the office fluorescent lights. The hum of the building, once comforting, now seemed like a backdrop to a quiet alarm. Each entry I examined raised more questions than answers. The ledger, meticulous as it was, revealed gaps and inconsistencies that no honest mistake could explain. I thought of my years here, the long nights balancing books, reconciling errors, catching issues before clients ever saw them. Now those same skills were the only thing protecting the company from a breach I could not yet fully quantify. I felt the weight of responsibility pressing down heavier than ever before. Someone I had trusted implicitly might be undermining everything I had worked for our company, our family legacy, even the very trust I thought unbreakable. As I closed my laptop that evening, the city's lights reflected in the windows like shards of concern scattered across the skyline. I knew this investigation was only beginning. The ledger had whispered its secrets tonight, and I had listened. But whatever I would uncover next, it was certain that things could no longer be taken at face value. The quiet alarm had grown into something sharp, and I would have to confront it no matter the cost. The next morning, I tried to bring up the irregularities with Thomas first. He was at his usual spot in the corner office phone pressed to his ear, his charisma filling the room even before I spoke. I cleared my throat. Thomas, I need to go over some transactions I've found in the ledger. There are several unapproved payments. He glanced at me briefly, a polite but dismissive smile playing on his lips. Eleanor, I'm in the middle of something critical. Can it wait? I pressed, holding my gaze. It can't. These are discrepancies that could affect the company's finances. He sighed, letting out a small, impatient laugh. You worry too much. Everything's fine. Let it go. I left his office, the knot in my chest tightening. That was Thomas, charming, confident, and frustratingly impervious to concern when it didn't fit his narrative. I tried Caroline next, catching her in the break room between meetings. Caroline, have you looked at the recent ledger entries? There are multiple vague payments, and I need your insight, I said, attempting calm. She hesitated, picking at her coffee cup. Eleanor, maybe you're overthinking it. You know how Dad and Mom are. They hate tension. Just let Thomas handle it. It's probably nothing. Her words felt like a slap. She had always been the peacemaker, the one who smoothed conflicts, but her response now made me feel small, isolated. I nodded politely, but inside my frustration boiled. I had raised these concerns carefully, logically, and yet no one seemed willing to meet me halfway. I decided to reach out to Aaron next. I sent a text summarizing the findings and asking if he could discuss them in person. Hours passed without a reply. Later, I caught a glimpse of him in the hallway, distracted, hurried, avoiding eye contact. He gave a half smile that didn't reach his eyes and hurried past me, phone pressed to his ear. My chest tightened again. Even my son, the person I had trusted above all, was putting distance between us. By the end of the day, the ledger entries I had painstakingly documented felt heavier than ever. Each attempt at confrontation had been met with evasion, dismissal, or avoidance. Isolation wrapped around me like a cold blanket. I sat in my office late into the night. Lights dim, spreadsheets open, the hum of the city outside my window, a distant murmur. I thought about the years I had devoted to this family and this company. I had sacrificed sleep, personal time, and peace of mind to ensure everything ran smoothly, only to find myself ignored, doubted, and alone. The professional concern I carried in my hands now felt inseparable from a personal ache. The ledger was no longer just numbers. It was a reflection of a foundation quietly cracking beneath me. I realized then that confronting these issues might take more than just facts and logic. It would require persistence, patience, and if necessary, solitude. I could feel the tension winding tighter in my shoulders, a reminder that sometimes the hardest battles are fought alone. The family I had trusted implicitly was proving itself unreliable at the exact moment their oversight mattered most. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling, letting the isolation settle around me. Tomorrow, I would have to decide my next move. I couldn't force belief or acknowledgement from others, but I could control how I responded to what I now knew. The confrontation was deferred, yes, but the ledger's quiet truth demanded action whether anyone else chose to hear it or not. The silence of the office at night had always been my sanctuary. But tonight, it felt different, ominous, charged with the weight of what I was about to uncover. I sat alone at my desk, the glow of the monitor illuminating my face as I scrolled through the ledger entries with painstaking care. Each row of numbers told a story, and now I could feel the narrative turning darker. It began with Pacific Horizon. One unexplained payment had been worrisome, but several more had appeared in the past 6 months, all bearing Thomas's authorization. There was no contract, no invoice, just a vague memo labeled consulting services. I ran a quick check, no registered address, no company website, no trace anywhere. My pulse quickened. This wasn't an oversight. Someone was deliberately hiding something. I began cross-referencing these payments with other accounts. That's when I noticed 4 more names that seemed innocuous at first, each appearing sporadically across different accounts. Northwest Consulting, Blue Ridge Solutions, Coastal Ventures, and Horizon Global. Each company had received substantial payments totaling over $7 million in the last 2 years. Individually, they might have gone unnoticed, but collectively, the pattern was impossible to ignore. I leaned back, rubbing my temples. The numbers didn't lie, and my years in finance had trained me to see the patterns others missed. The entries were carefully spread across different accounts, labeled as software upgrades, vendor retainers, or miscellaneous consulting fees. It was clear someone had gone to great lengths to obscure the trail. My stomach twisted at the thought, deliberate deception hiding in plain sight. Every transaction bore the unmistakable signature of Thomas. My chest tightened as I realized the implications. The sibling I had trusted, the one I had always admired for his charm and leadership, was at the center of a network designed to divert millions from the company. I tried to push the thought away, telling myself it could still be a mistake. But the more I examined the ledgers, the less plausible that seemed. I opened a new spreadsheet and began documenting everything: dates, amounts, accounts, memo notes, signatures. Each entry I logged made the picture clearer, but the sense of alarm grew heavier. I wasn't just uncovering irregularities, I was uncovering a carefully orchestrated scheme. The ledger had transformed from a tool of order into a map of betrayal. The hours slipped past, unnoticed. Outside, the Salt Lake City skyline shimmered against the Wasatch Mountains, indifferent to the quiet turmoil within the office. My eyes stung, my back ached, and yet I could not stop. Each new discovery was a piece of the puzzle, a clue that demanded attention. I felt the familiar pulse of determination surge through me, stronger than the fear or shock. I would not ignore what I had found. By the time I shut down my laptop, the outline of the deception had taken shape. Multiple shell companies' offshore transfers, deliberate concealment, and millions diverted without explanation. I knew confronting this wouldn't be easy. Thomas would deny everything, and the family might not believe me. But the truth was there, glaring in the spreadsheets, impossible to overlook. I sat back, chest tight, letting the weight of the discovery settle. For the first time in decades, I felt the full magnitude of what had been happening behind the scenes. This wasn't a simple error or a misunderstanding. It was calculated, intentional, and far-reaching. And I knew with a clarity that sent a shiver down my spine that I would have to dig even deeper to uncover every detail, no matter where it led. The office had emptied hours ago, leaving only the soft hum of the air conditioning and the distant flicker of security lights. I sat at my desk, surrounded by spreadsheets, bank statements, and a growing stack of printouts. Each page was a piece of the puzzle, and for the first time, the magnitude of what I had discovered settled fully in my chest. $7 million hidden across multiple shell companies, carefully masked by legitimate-sounding accounts and vague memo notes. I opened a new encrypted file on my laptop and began logging everything. Each transaction date and signature was meticulously recorded. I labeled and cross-referenced each payment, noting patterns, anomalies, and potential motives. I worked methodically with the precision of a detective unraveling a complex crime. The work demanded my full attention. Any misstep could allow a detail to slip through the cracks. The solitude was palpable. My colleagues had gone home. My siblings, even my son, were unaware of the depths I was probing. I could feel the weight of isolation pressing down, heavy and uncompromising. Normally, I thrived on collaboration, on discussing strategies and solutions with the people I trusted. Now, trust was fragile, and I could rely only on myself. I paused for a moment, resting my head in my hands. A shiver of fatigue ran through me, but I could not stop. Each new entry in my secret log confirmed the same uncomfortable truth. Someone within the family was actively undermining everything we had built. The ledger, which had always been a tool of order, had become a testament to deception. I was both horrified and resolute. Hours passed. I pored over every account, every memo, every piece of correspondence I could access. The night deepened, the city outside quiet and indifferent. I lit a second lamp when the darkness of the office pressed too close, the warm light spilling across spreadsheets and printouts like a small circle of safety. I sipped a lukewarm cup of coffee, letting the bitter taste sharpen my focus. Despite the isolation, a strange sense of intensity grew within me. The fear and alarm that had accompanied my initial discoveries were giving way to determination. I would not allow this to be swept under the rug, not while I had the knowledge, the skills, and the responsibility to act. Each careful entry, each cross-checked account was a step toward clarity, and eventually accountability. Sleep became a distant memory. I kept my encrypted drive close, knowing that what I held could change everything if revealed. And yet, in that quiet, meticulous work, I felt a strange empowerment. Alone against the odds, I was holding the line. My family might have chosen convenience over truth, blind loyalty over integrity, but I would not. I would bear the weight of this knowledge and use it wisely, even if it meant standing alone against them all. By the time the first light of dawn filtered through the blinds, the secret log had grown into a detailed map of deception. Every shell company, every offshore transfer, every suspicious entry was accounted for. I leaned back in my chair, exhausted but resolute, the hum of the city waking outside. This was no longer a simple investigation. It was a mission. One person's vigilance might be the only barrier between disaster and ruin, and I was determined to see it through to the end. I scheduled a meeting with Thomas and Caroline in the smaller conference room, away from the usual hum of the office. The late afternoon sunlight slanted through the blinds, casting sharp lines across the table. I could feel my pulse in my temples as I laid out the folder in front of me, the documents inside. Thick with evidence payments, shell companies, signatures, and timelines meticulously logged over the past weeks. Thomas leaned back in his chair, arms crossed his usual confident smile, only barely masking impatience. Caroline sat beside him, glancing at the documents with a faintly concerned expression, though I couldn't tell if it was for the facts or for me. I took a deep breath. Thomas, Caroline, I need you to look at these, I began, keeping my voice steady. Over the past 2 years, there have been repeated unapproved payments to companies that don't exist, signed off by Thomas. Each payment has been documented in the ledger, and I've cross-checked everything for accuracy. Thomas's eyes flicked briefly to mine, sharp, incredulous. Eleanor, this is absurd, he said. You're making a mountain out of nothing. These are normal business transactions and you're reading too much into it. I set the first page in front of him showing a payment labeled to Pacific Horizon. This isn't normal. There's no contract, no invoice, nothing to justify these payments. And it's not just this one. Caroline shifted uncomfortably, placing a hand over hers. Eleanor, maybe you're overreacting, she said, her tone cautious. Thomas wouldn't do anything to harm the company. You're stressing yourself out over something that's probably harmless. I felt a tight knot in my chest. Their words weren't just dismissive, they were a wall. I had expected resistance, but I hadn't anticipated the ease with which they would shield what I now knew to be deliberate. I leaned forward, tapping the spreadsheet. Look at the timeline. Northwest Consulting, Blue Ridge Solutions, Coastal Ventures. All these shell companies received payments totaling over $7 million in the last 2 years. Each entry has Thomas's approval. Each entry is inconsistent with any contract or vendor service. This is not oversight. This is a pattern. Thomas's jaw tightened. I don't see what you're suggesting, Eleanor. Are you accusing me of something? Yes, I said, keeping my voice calm but firm. I'm showing you what the numbers say. This is not an accusation without evidence. The evidence is right here. Caroline looked down at her lap, twisting a pen between her fingers. Eleanor, please, can we not make this personal? Maybe there's an explanation you haven't considered. The tension in the room pressed against me like a physical force. I had expected defensiveness, but the refusal to even acknowledge the possibility of wrongdoing stung deeper. I felt a mix of anger and disappointment, not just at Thomas, but at Caroline, too. The ledger didn't lie. The evidence was undeniable. And yet the people I trusted to see reason were choosing denial over truth. I closed the folder slowly, my hands trembling slightly, despite my effort to remain composed. If you won't look at the facts, there's nothing more I can say, I murmured. The words hung in the air, final but heavy. I could feel their gaze a mix of irritation and unease, but no acknowledgement of what I had uncovered. As I stood to leave, I glanced back at the table, at the 2 people I had counted on. They sat there silent, defensively protective of the very wrongdoing I had spent hours uncovering. My disappointment burned hotter than any anger. The room had shifted from confrontation to a wall of denial. I knew then that this path would not be easy, and that truth alone might not be enough to move them. The next family dinner should have been routine, a simple Thursday evening meal at my parents' home. I had arrived early, hoping to create a space for calm conversation after the confrontation with Thomas and Caroline, but the air was already taut when I stepped inside. The warm scent of roasted vegetables and baking bread did little to soften the tension, simmering beneath the surface. My parents, John and Marjorie Whitcomb, greeted me with polite smiles, but their eyes flickered briefly to the folder of documents I had carried in my bag. I had left it behind in the car, a conscious decision. I wanted this dinner to feel normal at least for a moment. But even the unspoken awareness of my work lingered in the room like a shadow. Thomas arrived shortly after shaking hands with Dad, exuding the easy confidence he always carried, the kind that could fill a room without anyone noticing the undercurrents he left in his wake. Caroline followed her demeanor cautious, tentative, as if she were balancing on a tightrope between loyalty to the family and the truth she had seen but refused to acknowledge. Aaron. My son came in last, avoiding my gaze and fidgeting with his phone. There was a stiffness in his shoulders, a subtle way of positioning himself at the edge of the room, 1 foot in the present, 1 foot out of the family's orbit. Even without words, it was clear the fracture that had begun weeks ago had widened, and I could feel it pressing against the fragile trust we had all relied upon. The meal began with the usual pleasantries, conversations about the weather, and updates on work and school. But beneath each statement, there was a current of avoidance. Thomas dominated the discussion of the company, outlining new initiatives and client strategies as if my presence didn't exist. He spoke in a tone that left little room for interruption, and when I tried to contribute, Caroline quickly redirected the conversation, her words polite but firm. Aaron barely looked up from his phone, tapping messages with mechanical precision. I caught his eye once, hoping for recognition, for even a flicker of connection, but he turned away, his expression unreadable. My chest tightened with disappointment. This was the child I had guided, mentored, and supported through every decision, now quietly distancing himself from me, trusting the surface over the substance. I focused on the meal, trying to steady my voice and my thoughts. The silence between topics grew longer, punctuated by soft laughter that seemed forced whispers that carried like tiny daggers just beyond my hearing. Each time I noticed an exchange, a subtle glance or a murmur, I felt the weight of exclusion. This was no longer simply a family dynamic. It was a web of alliances, loyalties, and selective blindness. I could feel the heartbreak settle into me, a physical ache that matched the mental exhaustion I had carried through the investigation. Every glance at Aaron, every dismissive nod from Caroline, every overconfident word from Thomas reminded me that the truth I had uncovered was not only unseen, but actively ignored. The ledger, the shell companies, the millions diverted, it all existed in a space my family refused to acknowledge. Even my parents, usually the anchors of reason and perspective, remained quiet when the tension escalated. Mom's eyes flickered with concern, but never fully met mine. Dad's expression was neutral, unreadable, as if he were balancing on the edge of confrontation and avoidance. Their silence was deafening, affirming in its subtlety that they would not intervene, would not question the denials that protected the guilty. I ate slowly, tasting the food, but feeling nothing, observing the fractured dynamics with clarity that hurt more than confusion ever could. My moral compass felt sharper than ever. I knew what was right, and I knew the consequences of letting these actions go unchecked. The family I had trusted to see reason had chosen convenience, loyalty to appearances over integrity, and in doing so had left me isolated in a way I had never experienced before. By the time dessert arrived, the tension had calcified. Words had been said, topics avoided, glances exchanged, and still nothing had changed. I set down my fork, my hands steady, despite the frustration coiling inside me. I understood now that standing for the truth would not win me approval or comfort. It would not even guarantee attention, but integrity, no matter how lonely the path, remained mine. As the meal drew to a close, I excused myself to the kitchen under the guise of clearing the dishes, but really to collect myself. The quiet of the room offered a temporary refuge, a chance to breathe and plan the next steps. Outside, Salt Lake City's nightlights shimmered through the window, indifferent to the fractures inside the Whitcomb home. I knew one thing with certainty: I could not stop, even if the family had already turned away. I returned to my apartment that night with a heaviness pressing against my chest, but also a clarity I hadn't felt in weeks. The ledger, the shell companies, the offshore transfers, They were not going to vanish simply because the family chose to ignore them. Each moment of silence, each dismissive glance, each whispered reassurance from Thomas and Caroline had made one thing painfully clear: if I didn't act, no one else would. I sat at my desk surrounded by printed spreadsheets, bank statements, and the faint glow of my laptop. I had spent countless hours cross-referencing transactions, noting inconsistencies, and verifying approvals. The picture was complete. Multiple shell companies, millions of dollars, diverted signatures forged or misused, and no one willing to acknowledge it. I felt a sharp pang of fear. Acting meant going against my family, risking relationships I had spent a lifetime nurturing. It meant stepping into territory that could ruin reputations, careers, and even the company. Yet beneath the fear, a steadiness grew. I knew that the integrity I had maintained for decades demanded more than passive observation. The ledger, my meticulous notes, and the undeniable evidence had become more than numbers. They were a responsibility, and I could not in good conscience let them be ignored or buried. I opened my browser and began researching whistleblower protections. The Taxpayer First Act IRS guidelines and secure reporting portals illuminated a path forward, one that could shield me legally while allowing the truth to surface. I read case studies of individuals who had stood alone revealing misconduct despite personal cost. Each story resonated with me, bolstering the determination that had been simmering beneath my exhaustion and worry. For hours, I organized my files, encrypting every document, labeling each payment, each date, each signature. I created a timeline that traced the flow of funds across accounts, companies, and offshore locations. Each piece was cross-referenced with emails, invoices, and internal memos. My hands moved methodically, almost automatically, while my mind replayed every dinner, every deflection, every whisper of denial from the family. It was painstaking work but necessary. Precision was the only ally I could trust in this storm. The fear never completely faded. I imagined the confrontations that might follow, the disbelief, the accusations, the potential for my credibility to be challenged. My son, the sibling I had trusted, even my parents, they might never see the truth the way I did. But the empowerment I felt from taking control of the situation outweighed the fear. For the first time in weeks, I felt the momentum shift. I was no longer reacting. I was initiating. By midnight, the structure of the report was complete. I had mapped every transaction, every shell company, and every suspicious approval. I had notes for every question that could be raised, evidence for every potential challenge. It was secure, thorough, and ready to submit through the proper channels. I leaned back in my chair, listening to the faint hum of the city beyond the window. The quiet was almost deafening, a reminder that no one else would be here to act with me. The decision was made. I would move forward anonymously if necessary and ensure that the truth was documented and protected. I could feel the weight of isolation, but it was accompanied by an acute sense of purpose. Silence had been complicity, and I was no longer willing to be silent. My mind sharpened, my focus absolute, as I imagined the steps I would take in the coming days. I finally stood, stretching stiff muscles, and glanced at the pile of evidence beside me. The fear, the uncertainty, and the loneliness were real, but they no longer paralyzed me. For the first time, I felt like the architect of action rather than a bystander. Whatever the consequences, I had chosen the path of accountability, and with it, a sliver of control over a situation that had felt uncontrollable for far too long. The hours stretched into early morning as I meticulously organized every piece of evidence I had collected. My desk was covered in printed bank statements, spreadsheets, and correspondence, each document carefully labeled and cross-referenced. Offshore accounts, shell companies, vague invoices, forged signatures, all of it lay before me in stark clarity. The enormity of what I had uncovered weighed heavily, but the structure of the evidence offered a strange, quiet reassurance. I created separate folders for each shell company: Pacific Horizon, Northwest Consulting, Blue Ridge Solutions, and Coastal Ventures. Each payment, each transfer, and every signature was logged chronologically with annotations linking them to supporting documents or highlighting discrepancies. Even the smallest unexplained fee, the tiniest anomaly, was noted. This was no longer about minor errors or innocent oversights. It was a deliberate pattern of deception, and I needed every detail to stand up to scrutiny. As I worked, I felt the tension coil tighter in my chest. The numbers were clear, but the human consequences were far murkier. Thomas's role in approving and directing these payments was evident, but confronting him or the family at large would carry risks I could not fully calculate. What would they say when the ledger, the invoices, the forged approvals were laid bare? Would they listen? Or would they dismiss me as paranoid, overly meticulous, or worse, a traitor? Caroline's hesitant glances earlier in the week echoed in my mind. She had seen parts of this, yet chosen inaction. Aaron, once so trusting, now seemed deliberately distant. The isolation I had felt during this investigation had sharpened, turning the solitude into a weapon of focus, but also a reminder of how alone I truly was. I paused, sipping tepid coffee, staring at the stacks of documents as if looking for reassurance. Each page told the same story: millions of dollars carefully funneled through legitimate-looking accounts hidden behind consulting memos and software upgrade labels. The pattern was undeniable. My pulse raced with anticipation and apprehension. I had come this far, and now there was no turning back. Every detail had to be correct, every connection precise. One mistake could undo everything I had spent weeks uncovering. I began consolidating the evidence into a secure, encrypted drive. Files were labeled, meticulously: transaction dates, amounts, account numbers, approval signatures, supporting emails. I double-checked every entry, every cross-reference, every note. My hands trembled slightly, not from exhaustion, but from the awareness of what I was holding. This was more than numbers. It was a record of betrayal, a map of deception that could shatter family bonds, reputations, and a company built over decades. By the time dawn's first light touched the Salt Lake City skyline, the compilation was complete. The tension that had wrapped around me all night was now a steady, focused energy. I knew what needed to be done next: confrontations, reporting, and preparation for the consequences that would inevitably follow. Mental preparation was as important as the documents themselves. I had to steel myself for denial, disbelief, and resistance because the people who had betrayed me would fight to maintain their illusions. Sitting back, I allowed myself a brief moment of clarity. Every payment accounted for every forged signature, documented every shell company traced. This was the truth, undeniable and complete. The anticipation of what came next, of facing the family, of ensuring accountability, sent a chill through me. But beneath the tension was an unshakable resolve. I had done the work. I had prepared. And I would not falter now. I arrived at my parents' house carrying the folder of evidence like a shield and a weapon. The drive had been quiet, each mile a rehearsal of the words I would say, the calm I needed to maintain, and the anger I could not afford to show too soon. The Whitcomb home was familiar and comforting in most ways, but tonight it felt like a stage for judgment. A place where years of unspoken tensions would collide with the truth I now held in my hands. Mom greeted me at the door with her usual soft smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. Dad, standing behind her, nodded stiffly, a gesture of welcome that barely concealed curiosity and an undercurrent of tension. I could feel it immediately. The room, the air, the furniture even seemed to hold its breath in anticipation. Thomas lounged on the sofa, a confident smirk already forming, and Caroline hovered near the kitchen doorway, hands clasped tightly, shifting her weight nervously. Aaron, my son, stood a little apart, arms folded, eyes darting from me to the folder in my hands. I laid the folder on the dining table, deliberately spreading the pages in neat stacks. I need you all to see this. I began, keeping my voice calm, deliberate, controlled. These are records of financial transactions, approvals, and payments that I cannot reconcile. They span 2 years and involve multiple shell companies and offshore accounts. Every entry is documented, cross-referenced, and verified. The pattern is deliberate, not accidental. Thomas's smirk faltered slightly, though he masked it quickly. Eleanor, this is ridiculous, he said smoothly. You're making assumptions. These numbers don't mean what you think they do. I flipped to a page marked Pacific Horizon, showing the signature clearly. This is not an assumption. This company does not exist yet. Payments totaling hundreds of thousands have gone to it, signed off by you, Thomas. This is the pattern I am talking about. And there's more. Caroline's eyes flickered to Thomas, hesitant, and then to me. Eleanor, maybe you're overreacting. He's not doing anything to hurt the company. These are legitimate business decisions. Her voice trembled slightly, betraying the discomfort she felt in defending her brother without fully understanding the scope. My heart sank. I had expected resistance, perhaps disbelief, but this casual dismissal, this ease with which they would protect the guilty party, hit harder than any confrontation I had imagined. Aaron's gaze fell to the table, avoiding mine, and my chest tightened. The son I had trusted, the child I had nurtured, the one I thought would understand integrity above all, now stood silently as a witness to the denial. I took a deep breath, steadying my trembling hands. These are not minor discrepancies, I said firmly. Northwest Consulting, Blue Ridge Solutions, Coastal Ventures, Horizon, Global. Each is a shell company. Each has received millions. Each has been signed off and concealed. I have verified the transactions, the accounts, the approvals, and the inconsistencies. This is not an accident. Thomas leaned forward, resting an elbow on his knee, a dismissive smile returning. Eleanor, you're reading too much into this. I've managed these accounts, these clients, and you've overanalyzed things. You've always been meticulous, but sometimes a spreadsheet isn't the full story. I clenched my fists under the table, forcing my voice to remain steady. The full story is right here, I said, tapping the folder. I've checked, rechecked, and cross-checked. These aren't mistakes. This is intentional, and it affects the integrity of the company, our legacy, and everyone involved. Mom's lips pressed into a thin line, her gaze fixed on the table. Dad leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled, evaluating but silent. Caroline's frown deepened, her fingers twisting together nervously. The silence was heavy, suffocating, broken only by Thomas's casual dismissal. You're trying to make yourself look important, Thomas continued, voice low but sharp. I've carried this company through major clients, handled the pressure you've never faced. Don't turn this into some moral crusade. A surge of anger and heartbreak twisted through me, but I forced myself to remain composed. My throat tightened, yet my hands stayed steady on the table. It is not about importance. It is about responsibility. What you call pressure, I call concealment. You've hidden decisions, misdirected funds, and compromised trust. I am showing you the facts, not opinions. And still you dismiss them. Caroline's eyes darted nervously between Thomas and me. Maybe there's an explanation you're not seeing, she whispered. Her voice held fear, loyalty, and uncertainty all at once. I shook my head slowly, the weight of betrayal settling into a cold, undeniable clarity. I am showing you everything, and you choose denial. You defend wrongdoing instead of confronting it. I have done my part carefully, thoroughly, and still you refuse to see. Aaron finally spoke, his voice quiet, almost a whisper. I don't know what to say. His hesitation, his inability to take a stand, cut deeper than Thomas's arguments. The child I had raised to value integrity now stood silent, while the truth I uncovered was ignored. I gathered the folder, sliding the documents back into neat stacks, my hands firm despite the ache in my chest. If you cannot acknowledge the facts, I cannot stay silent any longer. I will act to protect what is right, whether you follow or not. The room held its breath. Thomas leaned back, smirk-gone eyes narrowing slightly. Caroline's hand reached for mine, tentative, but I withdrew. Dad shifted in his chair, a frown forming. Mom's lips trembled, but no words came. Aaron looked away. I felt a resolve harden inside me, tempered with heartbreak as I realized that standing for justice might come at the cost of my family's approval, but I would not turn away. The folder of evidence sat in front of me one last time, each page meticulously organized, every transaction signature and offshore transfer documented with precision. I had spent weeks verifying every number, every date, every memo. Now the moment had come. I could no longer wait for recognition or acknowledgement from a family unwilling to face the truth. I had to act, and I had to act decisively. Sitting at my laptop, I opened the secure portal for anonymous whistleblower submissions. My hands hovered over the keyboard for a moment, the familiar tremor of anticipation running through me. Fear flitted at the edges of my thoughts, fear of backlash, fear of confrontation, fear of being misunderstood or vilified. But beneath the apprehension, a calm resolve anchored me. I was not acting out of vengeance nor for recognition. I was acting to preserve integrity, to protect the company, and to ensure that the truth could no longer be buried. I uploaded the files in stages spreadsheets cross-referencing each suspicious payment, scanned invoices, copies of forged signatures, and detailed notes tracing shell companies and offshore accounts. Each upload carried with it the weight of responsibility, the knowledge that this was irreversible. I double-checked each attachment, ensuring nothing was missing, that every piece of evidence could stand up to scrutiny. Once the final file was submitted, I leaned back in my chair, exhaling slowly. The tension coiled through me had begun to unwind, replaced by a strange clarity. The truth was now beyond concealment. It existed independently of belief, willful ignorance, or denial. And though I had acted alone, I felt a quiet vindication in knowing I had taken the step no one else would. By the next morning, the ripples of my action began to spread. Calls started coming in, panicked, urgent, confused. Thomas's voice was tight when he spoke, a hint of disbelief threading through his usual composure. Eleanor, what is going on? The auditors are asking questions. The board, how did they find out Caroline was quiet at first? Her usual calm replaced by tremulous anxiety. Eleanor, I didn't think, this wasn't supposed to happen, she said. Each word weighed with regret and fear. Aaron didn't even try to mask his shock. Mom, what did you do? His tone was half accusation, half plea. I didn't answer them with defensiveness or justification. I didn't argue or plead. I simply reminded myself that the work I had done, the preparation, and the evidence were solid. The ledger had spoken, the documents had spoken, and the truth was undeniable. I had set the mechanism in motion. What followed was the responsibility of those who had previously ignored it. As the day unfolded, reports came in of audits, internal reviews, and urgent inquiries from the board. The reality of the situation struck my family with increasing clarity. Panic replaced their earlier confidence. The company they had believed secure, the operations they thought stable, were suddenly under scrutiny. They realized in fragmented and frantic ways that the decisions they had made in defiance or denial now bore consequences they could not control. I watched it all unfold with a steady heart. There was tension, yes, but also a deep, quiet satisfaction. I had acted decisively when it mattered. The chaos around me no longer unsettled me because I knew I had done everything I could to ensure accountability. I had acted with precision, integrity, and courage. By evening, the house was quiet, the hum of the city outside a distant murmur. I sat back, hands folded over the folder of evidence now safely stored in a secure drive. The storm had begun, and my family was finally facing the consequences of their choices. Amid the turmoil, I felt calm, a hard-won calm that comes from standing firm in what is right, even when those you love refuse to see it. The following days unfolded in a blur of calls, emails, and urgent meetings. The shell company's offshore transfers and forged approvals that I had painstakingly documented became the focus of auditors and investigators. The company, once a stable foundation I had trusted, implicitly quivered under the weight of scrutiny. Brooks Tech, the enterprise my parents had built in a small Salt Lake City garage decades ago, was suddenly exposed as vulnerable, its operations destabilized by decisions some had hoped would remain hidden. Thomas was the first to act. I learned through the internal alerts and whispers among colleagues that he had left the city abruptly, flights booked, without explanation messages unanswered. The realization settled like ice in my stomach. His flight from responsibility confirmed what I had long suspected: he had orchestrated the deception, and now intended to escape its consequences. There was no charm, no excuses, only the stark truth of his absence and the trail of uncertainty he left behind. Caroline remained her usual calm, replaced by anxiety and guilt. She contacted me multiple times, her voice tight and trembling. "Eleanor, I didn't know it was this bad. I didn't understand." But there was no place for apologies to erase what had been done. The ledger, the evidence, and the auditor's inquiries made the reality undeniable. Even my parents, John and Marjorie, faced a reckoning they could no longer avoid. Calls from auditors and regulatory bodies continued without pause, each one outlining penalties, required investigations, and remedial actions. Their expressions, usually composed and steady, betrayed fear and disbelief. The authority they had once held both over the company and over their children had been eroded by years of oversight trust, misplaced and blind faith in appearances. I observed it all from a quiet distance, sitting in my home office, the evening light casting long shadows across the floor. There was no triumph in the chaos, only the heavy satisfaction that justice, however delayed, was being served. The consequences were harsh. Yes, financial penalties, destabilized operations, and a family forced to confront the repercussions of their choices, but they were deserved. Integrity, once ignored, had finally exerted its weight. Aaron, my son, remained close, finally beginning to reconcile his own perspective with the reality of events. His questions were tentative, peppered with uncertainty and remorse. He had witnessed the consequences firsthand, the collapse that followed unchecked ambition and deliberate deception. Slowly, I could see understanding begin to form, though the lessons were hard and uncomfortably clear. The company's leadership scrambled to stabilize operations, replacing Thomas's responsibilities and auditing every questionable transaction. Employees whispered about sudden resignations, urgent corrective measures, and the stark reminder that trust once broken leaves a long shadow. I had always believed that diligence and careful oversight mattered, but now the cost of complacency and loyalty without scrutiny was visible to all. And yet, amid the collapse, there was clarity and moral satisfaction. I had acted alone, guided only by facts, conscience, and a sense of responsibility that transcended personal loyalty. The chaos around me no longer unsettled me because I knew the truth had been revealed, and the guilty party held accountable, even if only partially. By the end of the week, the Whitcomb family was irrevocably changed. Thomas remained unreachable, the company destabilized, but recovering under new oversight, and the financial penalties enforced were a stark testament to the cost of deception. I felt a profound sadness for what had been lost, the relationships, the trust, the innocence of years past, but also a deep satisfaction. Justice had been served, and the ledger, silent for too long, had finally spoken. The apartment was quiet, filled only with the soft hum of the heater and the occasional flicker of city lights through the blinds. I had spent weeks unpacking, organizing, and setting routines that reminded me the life I was rebuilding belonged entirely to me. The weight of the past months, the deception, the confrontation, the chaos was still present, but it no longer controlled my every thought. I had reclaimed a piece of myself, one carefully measured decision at a time. My days were now spent consulting independently, guiding other businesses toward transparency and ethical practices. It was work I could immerse myself in completely, work where my experience and judgment mattered, free from the interference and blind loyalty that had once plagued Brooks Tech. I had chosen to step into this new role intentionally, with boundaries firmly in place, a conscious decision to protect both my peace and my integrity. Evenings were quieter than before, but in a comforting way. I cooked meals without distraction, sipped tea while reviewing reports at my own pace, and allowed myself small joys, a walk along the foothills of the Wasatch Mountains, a quiet conversation with a trusted friend, or a moment of reflection by the window overlooking the city. These rituals, though simple, grounded me in the present and reminded me of what I had fought to preserve. Aaron had begun to visit more often, his questions tentative at first, then gradually growing more open. We discussed the lessons of accountability and responsibility, the consequences of deception, and the importance of integrity. There was still distance to bridge, but I could see a new understanding forming. He respected the choices I had made, even when they had been difficult or unpopular. I thought about the family I had left behind, the fractured relationships, the betrayal, and the lessons etched in every ledger and email I had logged. They were a reminder of the cost of misplaced trust and blind loyalty, but also of my own strength and resilience. I had acted when no one else would, and in doing so I had preserved what mattered most: my conscience, my freedom, and my dignity. The city lights twinkled across Salt Lake City. As I settled into the quiet evening, the hum of life continuing below. For the first time in months, I felt complete in a way that wasn't dependent on anyone else's recognition or approval. I had rebuilt my life on my own terms, and for the first time in a long while, the future felt entirely mine to shape.